I can see folks are joining. So welcome from Dallas, Texas. We're delighted to have you. And before we kick off, before we get started, welcome from Argentina. Let's just level set a little bit for the room so that we can make sure that we're using this time together equitably and that we're all starting from the same page. So firstly, as we get started, turn on your camera if you're able to, and if you're in a position to. We would love to see your faces. And you don't obviously have to be IG perfect. This is a pretty small, intimate room. So if we can see you, it's always so much nicer to present to real people instead of little boxes. We are going to be recording, and we'll email a rewatch link in a few days, or you can find it posted on our YouTube channel later today. Alex, welcome from Ontario. Our presenter today, Sharon, is also from Canada. And lastly, if you have any questions, if you have anything that you want to add to the conversation, any thoughts, please do drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. And if there's anything that you'd like to ask anonymously or privately, feel free to message me directly, and I'll make sure that I ask the question in the chat, ask the question to our facilitator, Sharon. I'm going to get there, folks. If any of you are parents of young children, I apologize if you can hear my small son having his morning meltdown in the background. I'd like to introduce us this morning to Sharon Gai. Sharon, welcome. We are so excited to have you. Sharon is a China-born Canadian. She's a DEIB expert in cultural intelligence, and her TEDx talk, Culture Fluid, sparked a new way for companies to think about belonging in the workplace. Her motto is getting comfortable with the uncomfortable as a way to combat the polarization that we see in workplace and society. Sharon's also a much sought after keynote speaker. Aside from her TEDx speak, she's on the AAE list of top keynote speakers in 2023. She's appeared on CBC, CCTV, TechCrunch, Retail Asia, NextWeb, and this is just a select few of the places she has spoken at, and also authored the book, E-Commerce Reimagined, What We Can Learn in Retail and E-Commerce from China. Sharon, I am going to give you the floor, and just so that everybody knows how we're going to use this time together, Sharon's going to present for about 30 or so minutes, and then we're going to go through some of the pre-submitted questions that we got before the event started. You should have had a chance to submit any questions if you had some. If not, no problem. As I said, you can drop them in the chat, and if you want to ask anonymously, just direct message me. Sharon, the floor is yours. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Sari. It's really great to be here. My name is Sharon Gai, and thank you, Sari, for the lovely introduction. I will be sharing my screen in a bit just to go through some of the pieces in culture fluidity and being culture fluid. I read a lot of the questions that people had sent in. It looks like a lot of people have already gone to know constructs or pieces of being culture fluid. But to level set, I usually like to start from the beginning and go through this quick presentation, and I'll try to breeze through it as quickly as I can so that we have more time for question and answers and making this more interactive. Without further ado, I first want to introduce the website for my DI consultancy called culture-fluid.com, where I teach individuals classes on being culture fluid. I work with corporations in hosting workshops internally, either in person or virtual on this topic. CQ certification, so cultural intelligence is this thing that's bubbling recently because of a lot of the globalization practices that a lot of companies are doing, outsourcing of teams abroad. We find that a lot of leaders are interested in becoming CQ certified or being more culturally intelligent. And then lastly, I also host a community of people who are what I call culture fluid, or supporters or allies of people who identify as culture fluid. So I'll start off the presentation by asking a simple question of where are you from, and feel free to type in the chat where you're from, or how you interpret the question. But for me, this is usually me breaking out in a sweat when people ask me where I'm from. I don't know whether to say if it's my ethnicity, where I live right now, 5-minute family history, where I was born, where my mom is from. And in these little letters, it says launching into an obstructionist rant and questioning, why is this even being asked? And the reason for that is, for me, it's very complicated because of the different places that I was born in and associated with. So I was originally born in China. This is me as a little kid. I was a very shy kid. I had social anxiety. I was very afraid of talking to strangers. And when I was around 7, I moved to Canada, to Vancouver. And it was there that I first had this wave of new culture hit me. I had to learn this new language and be in this new culture, and just be in a position where I was the minority, or where I felt like I had to do something to fit in, or feel or do something to feel like I belong. So I remember this one day where it was the first couple of days to school, and I bring dumplings. So we always ate dumplings in northeastern China. And I bring it to lunch, and I sit down with a group of people, and a big ew erupts, and everyone covers their noses. And I think that was the first time that I felt very targeted. And I was really sad that day. I threw my lunch in the garbage eventually, and I told my mom to bring me more Canadian lunches from then on to fit in like the other kids. And then I think for me, it was a series of Americanization or North Americanization, because I was living in Canada. I changed a lot of the aspects of me that made me who I was. I changed a lot of the brands that I wore, shows that I watched, ways that I said things or spoke about things. And it was a wave of assimilation. And it wasn't until a couple of decades later that I go back to China, when I started working at Alibaba, that where I thought, I was finally in a country where everyone looked like me. Surely I would be accepted there. But little to my surprise, I was then othered again. So that I remember there was this one time where we were hosting an internal workshop, and the concept of 996 came up. So 996 is a common working phenomenon in Chinese tech firms, where you work a lot from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And we were talking about our opinions about that. And I expressed disagreement. And then someone chimed in and said, oh, then you're definitely not Chinese. So it was at that time that I felt like it seemed like I belonged everywhere and also nowhere all at once. And this is when I came up with this idea of being culture fluid. And culture fluid means someone who chooses to identify with multiple cultures and cannot be boxed in one. There's about 220 million people in the world right now who identifies this way. So somebody who's either moved countries, been an expat, or someone who just knows or is very sensitive to these cultural differences. And culture is something that it can be as large as a culture of a country to as small as the culture of a family or the culture of an individual. And so I eventually learned to embrace these sort of differences and to take differences as my strength instead of a weakness. And this is something that I teach to a lot of people who feel culture fluid, in the sense that they can actually be a bridge to varying groups of different cultures. So this is in my TED Talk, this bridge construct. So the first of which is this idea of cultural relativism. And it contrasts ethnocentrism, which dates as far back as Herodotus, who was a Greek historian. So the first time that we saw ethnocentrism happen is when he was someone from Greece, and he saw Egyptians for the first time. And he saw that a lot of the ways of Egyptians were very contrary to the Greeks. So they would eat outside, they would live with their animals. The way that they wrote was from left to right instead of right to left. And at first he thought, oh, what a group of such weird people. In the end, though, he vouched for cultural relativism, which is the desire to understand cultural practices of other groups in its own cultural context. And he concluded that the Egyptians were doing things not in a wrong way, but in a different way. And the second pillar of being culture fluid is the idea of perspectives. So this is a very famous photo for looking at perspectives. If we ask someone who's on the left side of the corner of the room looking at this shape, and you ask them, what shape is this? They'll say it's a circle. If you ask someone who's sitting on the right and you ask them what shape this is, they'll probably say it's a square. But in reality, this object is a three-dimensional and much more complex thing than just a very two-dimensional photo. That it's actually both a square and a circle are both correct answers. And so learning to shift our perspectives in this way is something that I had also done many times. And in my TED Talks, I talk about how I shifted my perspective on the topic of abortion. And the third step to being culture fluid is called dialectical thinking. So we live in a very polarized time, whether it's globally or in the US. In the US for sure, it's extremely, extremely polarized right now. And there's a lot of things are a us versus them problem, and people are becoming very tribal. Social media doesn't help. You might also argue that social media is the culprit in that the social media algorithms that have tuned us to serve us information, it's always the metric that they use is the like button. So if I read something, I don't really agree with it, or it's made me think in a different way, I won't necessarily be liking it. Instead, what I would press the like button for are ideas or things that I already know. You see this with TikTok, where you scroll video after video. You often double tap on the videos that is expressing an idea that you believe in. So what this then creates as an effect is many echo chambers with one person, with two people, and then it spreads within communities. And then what happens is we become less resilient to people that have an opposing idea. So this is a cartoon version of this, which is an unpopular opinion, where cancel culture is very strong in trying to remove this unpopular opinion. The reverse side of polarization is what we call dialectical thinking. So what that is the ability to view issues from multiple perspectives and to arrive at an economical and reasonable reconciliation of seemingly contradictory information and postures. So here's an example or a difference between linear thinking and dialectical thinking. So linear thinking is very mathematical. So if A equals to B, B equals to C, then C must equal to A. We've all seen this, right? So an example is if people who eat junk food are unhealthy and John eats junk food, then John must be unhealthy. Dialectical thinking, on the other hand, is where we see things as possible Venn diagrams. So these are seemingly contradictory, but there is actually still a chance that John sits right in the middle. The fourth part for Culture Fluid is what we call Helens Razor, and this is a tool of that can build your mental resilience when anytime you have some sort of thing that's spoken to you that you don't necessarily agree with or kind of ticks you off a little bit. So an example here is I had a friend when I was working in China. She was an American and her boss was Chinese. And one time her boss made a comment to her And he said, your proposal that you handed in last week is so tropical. It's unlike the Chinese ones. And immediately she went into a negative thought pattern. She thought, oh, was her work not done right? Is tropical an insult here? She bad at her job. And when he repeated this again in one of her quarterly business reviews, she erupted in frustration, and she became very angry of why he would ridicule her in such a way. And her boss simply said, tropical means three, does it not? Red, yellow, green. That was what I meant with being tropical. And then she remembered back how the proposal template that she handed in had these three colors. And so it wasn't that he was insulting her work in any way. It was a complete misunderstanding from her part. So this was when Helens Razor was a thing that we both discussed after the fact. And in quotes, Helens Razor means there's no need to attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by ignorance or stupidity. Or we would say ignorance in this sense, because it was simply a misunderstanding of language. And this just teaches us that sometimes we think people are insulting us and we are very sensitive or ticked off by it, but really it can be just a misunderstanding. And sometimes we don't really know where that person is coming from. And knowing this builds our self-awareness to not just jump into a conclusion or jump into a negative place, but to instead pause and pause and reflect and think about where that person, what that person might mean. Which leads us to the last pillar of culture fluid, which was called context, or trying to obtain context. So living in North America, and I'm sure a lot of maybe people who are who's a minority anywhere in the world, maybe you've also experienced microaggressions here and there. And every time when I used to hear a microaggression, I also eventually went into a very, very negative place immediately. But then I realized that it's always important to find out more about context. That when people are asking me, where are you really from? Or, oh, you speak English so well, that I want to think a bit more about why they're saying what they're saying. Where are they from? Where did they grow up? How did they grow up? Where were they educated? And why did they think the way that they do? And trying to obtain context from anything, any situation that presents itself is a good muscle to build on. So our workforce, whether it's in the US or across the world, is increasingly going to get more global. We continue to have remote or hybrid roles. We're always trying to hire for more diverse talent. Companies are continually to globalize. There's also might be lower labor costs elsewhere. So a lot of the companies, or the trend right now, is for more and more diverse cultures to enter our workforce. And so it means that the idea of being culturally fluid, or being aware of these different cultures is a much more needed, or it's going to be an increasingly needed way of thinking. And this sort of mindset will be more and more relevant. So this is why I built up the consultancy that I did, where I teach people about being culture fluid individually, whether you are someone who's culture fluid and you want to learn how to use your skills to better navigate this world, or walking into companies and doing workshops on being culture fluid. So today I presented a small snippet of what I usually workshop, and being certified in becoming more culturally intelligent. And lastly, building a community of culture fluid people, where people can come together who might have had different cultural experiences, and want to share your own stories, or find a group of people who can empathize with what you've been through, and to be that bridge builder. So I would encourage you to check out the website if you would like. And this is my LinkedIn and IG as well, if you want to follow me or connect with me. And feel free to also scan this code if you want to directly write a message to me. But I think we do have some time today to go through some of the questions that some of you had written up. And I'll give it back to Sari.
Sharon, that was amazing. And I do this work for a living and learned so much in the 20 minutes that you spoke, and related to so much, particularly the anxiety around the "where are you from" question and how to answer that, and feeling like wherever I am, I belong to the other place. When I go home to India, they don't see me as Indian at all. And when I'm here, I'm never really here. People are always like, but are you Indian? You know, right? Like the totally, who am I? Where do I fit in? And even more complicated, I mentioned I have a young son who will have been born here in the US. And will be even one step further removed from our culture. So, but he will look Indian. So how do I teach my Indian son to be Indian when it's not even a place that he has any connection to? So I think about all of those things a lot. So thank you for that. I love this idea of the bridge, and your background makes a lot of sense now too.
Yeah, I think for me also, it's been through a lot of trials and tribulations. And I think in the first phase of my life, all I wanted to do was wipe away the Chinese parts of me, right? Try to become as local as possible. I sometimes even just wanted to pretend that, oh no, I was born here. That's why I sound like the way that I was. And it wasn't until much older that I realized that being a little different is my strength, and why am I trying to wipe that away? So I present this topic to many people during AAPI month, where a lot of anyone from that immigrant community can all sort of feel this way, where they're neither here nor there. And it's a eventual realization that what makes you different is what makes you special.
I think there are folks in here, hopefully not just me, who can also relate to the lunch throwing incident. I have thrown away many beautifully prepared meals from my mother, meals that I would kill to have now that I live on the other side of the world to her. So yes, I can relate to that. Let's dive into some of the questions that our audience has asked. And folks, as I said at the beginning, if you have questions you would like to ask of Sharon, please do drop them in the chat and I will do my best to get to them. So let's start with multicultural teams. What types of activities or exercises can multicultural teams participate in to get to know each other better and to develop stronger relationships, to get more culture fluid?
Yeah. So I used to do in this consultancy practice, we used to do something called the social network analysis. This comes from a branch of thought called knowledge management. And what it is bringing the social media concept into a workplace. So knowing who connects to who at work. And we start off by doing a survey of asking, who do you usually go to for X, Y, and Z? For X, Y, and Z topic? Who are you most closest to? Who do you have these informal types of bridges? And so if you can imagine a network of dots, and if each dot was an employee, after you ask this survey, you can see which dots are connected. And sometimes you can also see hubs. So you can see many different dots being connected to a central dot. Usually that person is then the bridge of this team or a larger company. You'll also see some fringe sort of dots on the periphery where they're not really connected at all, or they're connected with one bridge to one other individual, and that individual connects to someone else. So that's where we find to be a place of improvement. And usually we find that these people are usually in remote offices or in another country. And these people are not as well connected to the central team, maybe the people in headquarters, which are very deeply connected with each other. And so one exercise that we do is use a matching type of platform. There's something called Meetsy. There's another thing called Orbit. Both of these are it's a matching platform where if everyone agrees to build these relationships across the offices, that every month you get a new match, and this match is someone from another team. So say if you work in marketing, we would match someone with you in operations, for example. If you're in engineering, we'll match you with someone in sales. And you'll have these matches start happening 6 months after the fact, or sometime after the fact. We look at this company again and we do the same survey. We notice that there's now a lot more bridges happening internally, where the entire company is a lot more connected, both formally and informally. And the stronger or the more often you have these informal bridges happening, the more together this team is, because everyone is then getting to know each other on a more informal and closer personal basis. And that really helps with teams or companies that are very geographically distributed around the world.
Yeah, I love that. Finding ways to bring the people on the fringes closer into the center and build those relationships. How can we educate line managers on the importance of being culturally intelligent and proactively inclusive, particularly when it seems like these senior leaders are so time poor?
Yeah. So this is similar. The way that I see cultural intelligence emerging as this new field is similar to when emotional intelligence appeared about 10 years ago with someone called Daniel Goleman, who was a psychologist who started this EQ thing. He said that there's IQ and then there's EQ, and it's a whole school of thought where in our relationships at work, your IQ is important, but the way that you can deal with people and how high your EQ is often going to be a predictor of how well you can function with a team, how well you can lead, and how successful you'll be at that organization. So the 3.0 of intelligence we say is CQ, or cultural intelligence, where we've now evolved from the IQ to the EQ to being culturally intelligent, because we're now hiring from so many different countries, people of so many different backgrounds, and people coming into work into teams with their own type of culture. So knowing how to navigate that is a very important part of, again, how you can work well in a team, how you can lead, how you can manage different personalities. So never having the time to learn is more, would you want to invest time in bettering this part of yourself so that you can do better in your job? So that you can lead bigger teams and so that you can take on more challenging projects. This is what we usually would say to line managers, this is a personal development, or it's developing their own skill set to prepare them better for a more culturally diverse future.
Yeah, and I think giving that feedback when possible too, to say that this is a skill that if your manager doesn't have it is something that they need, and then encouraging them to invest the time in that. Usually when you give that feedback in formal channels, people are able to find the time to invest in it because it directly impacts their career, right? And I think we can all relate to the time poor part of it. You mentioned microaggressions briefly, and I appreciate the idea of thinking about the context of the person asking it, but I also think it's really important that we address microaggressions when they happen, because the context doesn't intent doesn't reflect impact, right? Like the context doesn't negate the harm that can be caused. So what are some effective strategies for calling people into better behaviors in the workplace?
I think definitely talking to them directly, and having an open discussion of what had happened. So I work with a lot of ERG leaders where these discussions are constantly happening within their teams, where there are stories that happen in a workplace where somebody feels like they have been discriminated against, or there were times where things have been said to them that they didn't really like, and they wanted to have a mark of telling their story. And so ERGs is a great place where you can do that, where you can have that open discussion, calling it out with your manager, with HR, saying it out loud instead of sweeping it under the rug is the most important thing to do, because there's four natural responses when we have conflict appear in front of us. So there's shame, blame, control, and escape. And in the face of microaggressions, a lot of people falter towards the escape side, where they want to pretend that everything's okay, sweeping it under the rug, and try to pretend that it didn't happen. But when one person starts doing that, and it starts to multiply to a lot of other individuals, when a lot of people also start to sweep it under the rug, that's when microaggressions bubble. And we have this pyramid that we usually look at when we look at microaggressions and how it develops into stereotypes and then a prejudice. And then it worsens into racism or discrimination, and then it worsens from there. So that's why it's very important to address it when it's at that base layer, when it is a microaggression, to call it out in a open, honest, fair way, and to think back with some of the things in the culture fluid bridge, which is you see a microaggression, instead of blaming the other person or finger pointing or trying to put that person on a peer, to just address it openly and with honesty, and be curious. Why did you say that? What was it that that you saw while you were growing up, or that you experienced, that made you have this, or have this thought? So addressing that in a open forum and with this person individually really helps quell this sort of microaggression to stop it permeate the workplace.
I love that. A couple of filters that I like to apply are, is this situation best addressed publicly right now, or is this best addressed privately, right? Like there are some where it's really important from a cultural perspective that because it happened in a really public way, that it's addressed in a really public way. And then there are others where addressing it in a public way is probably not going to get the response that you want, which is that we want this person to understand and course correct, right? Like that's what calling someone is versus calling them out when you call them in. And so what's the right approach here, the public versus the private? And then the simplest question to ask is, what do you mean by that? And usually that triggers a conversation that you can go from there. What did you mean by that? Sometimes even just if it's a joke, like getting someone to explain the joke can highlight, how unfunny what they just said was, or toxic, or racist, homophobic, whatever it was, microaggression-y. So what did you mean by that can be a really powerful question, and one that's helpful when there's a power dynamic, so you don't want to come across as the aggressor in the situation, which is also something at work particularly that we should think about, right? Like the power dynamic at play. What are some things that allies can do? So folks from historically privileged groups, what can they keep in mind when they're trying to be a bridge?
I think first recognizing the possible differences and trying in your own way, shape, or form of experiencing that new culture. I usually have a slide also in these workshops where I talk about what the things that you can do to become more culture fluid. So if you work with a lot of people from a certain culture, maybe looking at some of the eating some of the foods that they eat, or watching some of the shows that they watch, or listening to some of the songs that they listen to, and getting to know that culture better. And sometimes I also think that there's a difference in culture, not just between countries, so ethnic cultures, but there's also a difference in culture of age, of different people from different age groups. So we're in an interesting time right now where there's 5 different generations working in our workforce, from Gen Z to boomers. And I see this culture fluid concept being relevant to these different age groups as well. So we've all heard where, a lot of boomers maybe say, oh, these Gen Z people, we don't know how to relate to them anymore. How do we engage them? And then there's the Gen Z talking about the boomers in the same way, when really these two groups can be so much closer if they just try to experience a little bit of what that age group is, and try to understand them in that way. So the more you try to step out of your own comfort zone and comfort culture and going into a foreign culture that you don't know, the better you'll be when you're communicating with them.
I facilitated so many conversations with so many wonderful, thoughtful speakers and experts, and your answer kind of really tracks with what every single speaker has said when it comes to allyship, which is extend empathy to the other person and try to learn as much as you can about other folks that aren't like you. The more that you could be aware of how other people move through the world. And I think it's the starting point, which you mentioned, was being aware of your own cultural context, right? Like, you begin with yourself. What are your privileges? What are your inequities? What shapes your worldview? How were you raised, and how does that inform what you think is right or normal, or even weird? I think is sort of like the standard answer for allyship. On the flip side of that, being a minority carries a burden with it. Being that bridge carries a burden and a responsibility, and all of it can be quite draining. So what can we do as we're trying to be a bridge to ensure our own safety and our own well-being?
Yeah, so setting boundaries is very important. It can feel very tiring being a bridge. You have to constantly translate between two cultures, make sure both sides are okay. You have to mediate both sides. I definitely felt that way when I was in China and I was working with a Chinese leadership team, and then a lot of the peers were not from China, were from other countries, and I was that central point where I had to, have my left and right side talk peacefully, or do things, or collaborate together in a team setting. And sometimes I would take a break. I would just say, this meeting, these are the things that we went over last meeting. These are the tools that we can use for this meeting. I'm gonna step out. And sometimes it took 1 or 2 times where they tried to figure out how to work best with each other without me there. But that's also part of the learning process, is there's not these bridge type of personalities or characters everywhere we go. Sometimes we're launching ourselves in the deep end with just a completely new culture that we're not that familiar with. And that's part of the fun too. It's part of the learning process to discover what is this new culture that we're jumping into. How do they speak? How do they orient themselves? And so it's a fun process being the bridge, but also you have to take breaks from time to time.
Yes. So I heard you say setting boundaries, taking breaks, and then sometimes just letting folks figure it out for themselves, not playing the role of the bridge and sort of giving yourself a little piece. All of which I couldn't agree with more. How can we best facilitate learning and development in the workplace when groups comprise people from across different cultures?
I think, sorry, what was the question?
What's the best way to facilitate learning and development in the workplace when groups, when people are from everywhere, from across different cultures?
Yeah, I think first realizing that it's really fun when you're in a group setting, whether it's a manager training or leadership training, and your peers are coming from different countries or different cultures. I often find that these type of situations, I learn a lot more than if I was in a leadership training with my peers that are all from a similar background. I think it feels very nice and comfortable when people can empathize with you because they've come from the same background as you have, but it's more interesting when people are not. So this is always a reminder that I give to a lot of people who are in a learning and development role, is to also curate teams. So often when we do workshops or group discussions, to make sure that the little teams that you're setting up, maybe the 4 to 5 people that you have seated around a table, that they come from different age groups, different departments, different cultures, because that's when you have the coolest sparks happening in terms of discussions. Maybe often that's where a lot of disagreements will happen also, because that's just the different ways that they see things or have been through things. But that usually is at the crux of what creativity and innovation can stem from too, is when we have a lot of people that are different coming together to discuss a topic.
I love that question and I love that answer. Thank you. We do have a question from the audience. Charlene has asked a wonderful question. She says, hello from Alaska. I'm getting ready to launch a training program around Alaska Native people, history, cultures. I'm Alaska Native and find that many people don't know much about the different cultures in Alaska and or how to work with and collaborate with us. Do you have any words of wisdom for me in proceeding with this programming?
Sure. So I think it is, first of all, I think it's such a cool program that you have a chance to teach that, and there's people that's going to be there to listen. I think that's such a pivotal part of our history to learn as people who live in the US. I think anytime you're teaching something different, people will often have their preconceived stereotypes of thinking what they might learn. And I think it's important to mention that. So I would open your training modules or programs with just asking the group, what do you think I'm going to teach you? What do you think, what does that mean when I say Alaska? What does that evoke? And just listening to that room and seeing what bubbles up is a good first indicator of the people that you're teaching, their understanding of you, because it might be very, very far away from what you're about to teach, or it might be very close and you might be very surprised at that. And then when you're teaching it, just be very open and honest in the way that you see things. Say some caveats like, this is how I've perceived things. This is my story and my story only, and being very conscious of not overlaying and saying that what I'm about to teach you is the golden standard, or this is the way of this is the way that this thing is going to be taught. Being conscious that you are your own story, and this is a very unique story to you, and just reminding people while listening to that there's a lot more questions that they can ask, that curiosity is something that is applauded, that there's no stupid questions, because often when we're facing different cultures, some people also shy away because they don't want to seem like I'm stereotyping, or, oh, this is something that I just expect. And then it causes a lot of us to also quiet ourselves and not be curious. When it's a very open forum, it's always best to have curiosity at the forefront, and authenticity and sincerity as the response. So having those elements creates what we call that safe space that is great for learning.
So what I heard you say was meeting people where they're at by first finding out where they're at, which I think is so critical. And reminding folks that we are not a monolith, regardless of the we, right? Where whoever is the speaker, and that they should regard each person as an individual, both of which are such powerful things. So thank you for sharing that. And Charlene has also commented and said how powerful that was. This sort of ties to what Charlene was asking. What techniques can you recommend for folks to stay grounded in your own authentic experience, while also signaling to individuals from other cultures that you're allied with them?
Yeah. So I also, in my workshops, I like to bring up someone called Brene Brown. I know a lot of people have heard her, a lot of the things that she talks about. A quote that I really like from her is on belonging, is juxtaposing between fitting in, changing yourself, and feeling like you belong. So she juxtaposes these two concepts of fitting in and belonging. So fitting in is when you're changing yourself to fit the full, the larger picture. So that was me when I tried to assimilate and fit into my my young Canadian upbringing. And later on, instead feeling like a belong, where I don't have to change much about myself. I show up as who I am. I eat what I eat, I wear what I wear, I watch what I watch, and this is me, and still feeling like I belong. I think it's important for us to be aware of that difference, because oftentimes we falter on one side, or on the first side, and we forget about the things that are so important to us that make us really unique. And so I'd say some techniques is just remembering that you're different, and that's what makes you very special. And just bringing your authentic self, instead of trying to make yourself into this way or shape your form. Code switching is what we usually call it, and being a chameleon of sorts, and trying to make you fit into a certain shape, because that is the majority.
And the code switching is exhausting. If anybody here has done it, it is so tiring to have to remember who you are today and who you really are at home. I love this idea that you've introduced of fitting in versus truly belonging. And I wonder if anybody else here grew up in a home where assimilation was really important, right? Like, I was a migrant. I migrated from India to Australia with my parents, and like assimilating was just really important. It was almost like how we were going to survive, right? And so unlearning that I don't need to assimilate, that I can belong without necessarily acting like the majority, has been the work of my adulthood. And I can see a few nods in the audience. And by the way, if you agree with anything that Sharon is saying, feel also free to use your reactions. You can use the thumbs up button. It's always helpful to know that what's being said is resonating with folks, especially when you're talking to Black black boxes. There's a great question that was pre-submitted. How can I hold myself and my company accountable for embracing culture fluid or cultural intelligence without coming off as performative?
Yeah, so there's what we call tokenism in the diversity world, where we're just checking a box, right? We're hiring certain people because we want to check that box. We have a DEI report of some way, shape, or form that we have to produce because we're a publicly traded company. So we have to also prove these numbers. And so a lot of those things are performative. I think that personal transformation of being culture fluid happens on an individual basis, but it's definitely things that you can wield or build up in a company culture as well. So it could be as little as, what are the little quotes on the walls in your meeting rooms? Are they saying that differences should be celebrated, and that if you have a differing opinion, say it out loud? Is it being encouraged by leaders and managers and people that facilitate meetings to, instead of always having one voice dominate a meeting, the recurring weekly meetings, to ask some people who are not as loud or who are a bit shy in a Zoom meeting setting to speak up, and what do they think? Are the employees there trained with those type of facilitation skills? So are we listening from that grassroots layer? It eventually translates to up top as well. And this is something that I think that I talk about within the leadership chapter, is leadership doesn't always have to start with the C-levels or the VPs. It totally starts at the bottom. It's whenever we open our mouths in a meeting. It's the questions that we ask. Your little bit of behavior and the way that you think is very, it can be very impactful in those small instances. And you'll notice that when you orient yourself in that way, it encourages other people as well. So before, in my phase of assimilation, I never spoke up about this. I would never say, like the first couple of slides that I showed, the "where are you from?" I would not be talking about those things. But now I talk about it on a daily basis. And what I've noticed is once I started doing it, a lot of other people then stood up and did it too. And it just encourages other people who once upon a time didn't have that courage or that inkling to tell their story, is for them to stand up and tell it. And so I would say, don't underestimate the amount of power that you have as an individual, no matter your level in a company, because everything that you share or say out loud it has a lasting impact to those around you.
Yes. And I think the work that you're doing is so important and makes so many people feel seen and helps them to put words and sense around their experience. So thank you for the work that you do. You shared so many ideas in the last hour, but what is, do you think, the single most important step that a person can take to start being culture fluid, to start bridging the gap?
I think, yeah, the most important thing is probably being self-aware and learning to empathize, depending on what role you're playing. If you're playing that bridge builder role, is to be self-aware of these differences, and to recognize spots where you can start being that bridge. If you notice there are certain meetings you're stepping in where one side is very veering towards one direction and the other side is veering towards the other, can you step in and mediate and bring these two groups together? Can you start empathizing with both sides and kind of thinking, maybe if they both talked about this topic, or maybe if they both thought about this thing together, that they're able to find more similarities between these two opposing sides versus their differences. And then another thing is starting to share your own version or your own story. A lot of people like yourself who's moved different places, moved different countries, you've seen a lot of things. You've just experienced a lot of cultural happenings. And it's really a waste if you don't talk about it. And so by identifying in a workplace who those people are, getting them to step up and share the different cultural nuances that they've been part of is really helpful for everyone else, for them to listen to that story. And those are often very interesting stories too, because when you've shifted different cultures and countries, you also build up a lot of that implicit or tacit knowledge that is very underplayed or undiscovered in our work life. And so casting a spotlight onto those people is another thing that bridge builders can do for themselves.
Yeah, I like that. Learning from other bridge builders is kind of what you're alluding to a little bit, which I really love. As we wrap up, are there any last comments or key takeaways that you can share with the audience?
I would say if you're interested in learning more about being culture fluid, what it is, check out the website, which is in the chat, or follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn. I love just having calls with people to talk about this subject, because this is a topic where there's no right answer. Everyone has their own thoughts and opinions and way of going about things, and it's always been a discovery process. That's how I built up this type of philosophical construct that I did. It's through all of my conversations and little bits and pieces amalgamated together. Yeah, please connect with me, and we can debate, discuss. And that is basically the essence of culture fluid anyway.
Thank you for sharing that. Sharon's LinkedIn is also dropped into the chat, so please connect with her. We are at time, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you, Sharon, for sharing your time and your knowledge with this community. It was a pleasure hosting you, and thank you for being so vulnerable and open about your experiences. Yes, Alex's applause is all of our applause. Thank you. And folks, please join us in the future. Power to Fly hosts multiple conversations like this, and we'd love to see some of you again. Thank you.